Good morning. This is Ms. Nicholas. I'm going to be talking to you today about skin physiology, or what your skin does, and a little bit about how it does that. Before we begin, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the pen. It sometimes takes a minute to get this up and running, so bear with me as we get ready to roll. All right, let's just choose a color. I'll go with blue because I like blue. All right, we're up and rolling, ready to go. Okay, as I said, I'm going to be talking to you about skin physiology. The functions of the skin and the things that the skin does for you. It should be pretty obvious that your skin provides a protection in that it prevents things from getting into and out of your body. So you have this tough protective cover that provides a barrier. It's actually three different types of barriers. We have a physical, chemical, and biological barrier that provide protection. So we're wrapped in this skin head to toe by this physical barrier that prevents things from getting out or getting into the body simply because of that tough layer of keratinized protein that is accumulated within the skin. I know you've already been talked to about that keratin and its function, but it provides a waterproof barrier so we don't have extreme water loss or extreme water gain, and also several other factors that simply prevent things from entering the skin. The skin also secretes chemicals, so we have a chemical barrier. Some of those chemicals are going to be detrimental to bacteria, so they prevent bacteria from growing on your skin. Now keep in mind we also have lots and lots of bacteria that are a part of what we call our normal flora. So those are the bacteria that live in and on our bodies. But because of the mildly acidic component to the skin and some of the components that are secreted from glands within the skin, most of the pathogenic bacteria are killed off by those secretions. So the skin provides a chemical barrier. And a biological barrier is also provided by the skin in that the skin is within the skin, you have these different layers. Of course, you've already heard about the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. But within the dermis, particularly, you find lots of immune system cells, such as macrophages and phagocytes. Phage, P-H-A-G-E, means to eat. So phagocytic cells, such as these macrophages and these phagocytes, are going to be responsible for eating the invaders that do penetrate the barriers that we have talked about. All right, so that's a little bit about protection. That should seem pretty obvious. Your skin is also responsible for the excretion of a limited amount of nitrogenous waste, such as urea, ammonia, whoa, can't write today, and uric acid. Now, this is secreted in limited amounts in our sweat. Where do you primarily secrete these three types of waste? In the urine, absolutely. But some of these wastes, as I mentioned, are secreted through sweat glands, and that, of course, has to do with the skin. The third function we want to talk about is temperature regulation. If you've done your case studies in Unit 1 on thermoregulation, this should probably be pretty obvious to you as well. But let's think about how the skin actually regulates your temperature. You know, if you've been in Alabama very long, what happens when your body gets warm? You begin to sweat, right? Well, why do you sweat? You sweat because it's your body's effort to cool your body off. So when that sweat is coming out of the sweat glands and coming out through the pores, it's carrying body heat with it. And as that heat escapes with that liquid, of course the liquid evaporates, and that serves to cool the body off. Now, this happens when you get too warm, but this also happens throughout the day, even when you don't know that you are sweating. You typically lose up to about a half a liter of water per day in what we call insensible sweating. This is the sweating that just occurs. You can see how this happens next time you're in lab. Put your hand down on that black surface of your lab table and leave it there for a few minutes. When you raise your hand back up, you should see a moist little handprint there. So that's just illustrating the insensible sweating that is happening all the time. Okay, so that's how our skin works to help cool us off, because the sweat glands, of course, are located within the skin. But what about thermoregulation and warming us up? Does the skin have anything to do with that? Of course it does. The skin helps to prevent excessive heat loss, And one of the ways that it does that is through vasoconstriction, which means to constrict the blood vessels. Okay, so when your body gets too cold, your nervous system causes vasoconstriction to occur in the periphery. Okay, so in the limbs of the body and out to the superficial areas such as the skin, so that blood carrying that warm body temperature is pulled closer to the core of the body and taking care of the vital organs. So it allows the temperature of the skin to get a little bit closer to the temperature of the environment, because heat moves from a warmer area to a cooler area, so you lose less heat if your body allows your skin to become cooler. Make sense? Of course it does. The other way that the skin helps to regulate body temperature is through the fat layer or the adipose tissue that is a part of the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, because fat serves as an insulation. So it helps to regulate body temperature by keeping heat within the body. All right, the fourth thing we want to talk about as a function, of course, is the synthesis of a couple of different things. One is pigments, and you should have heard of this already. Melanin. Remember, melanin is the pigment that gives color to the skin, the eyes, the hair. So there are cells called melanocytes that are found in the skin that give color. They produce these pigments, these granules of melanin, that are stored in little vesicles known as melanosomes, and these melanosomes accumulate in other body cells. Do you know what the function of that melanin is? It's not just so we all have different skin colors. The function of that melanin is to protect the underlying cells. So what melanin does is to work like an umbrella. So if you've got a cell here, and here's your nucleus, okay, you're going to have melanin granules accumulate above that nucleus. So your sun is up here, right? Well, your sun, of course, emits UV radiation, which is going to shine down onto those cells. That melanin creates a little umbrella, and by doing so, it shields the DNA that's found within that nucleus and prevents UV radiation from damaging and mutating that DNA. Didn't know all that, did you? Of course you did. You've heard this before. All right, the other thing that the skin does, of course, is to synthesize some chemicals. One that's very important is vitamin D. We have precursors of vitamin D that are made when we are exposed to sunlight. So when you walk outside, even just 15 minutes of sunlight is going to cause these precursors to vitamin D to be made. And then, of course, those precursors are going to be synthesized, changed into the active vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for the absorption of calcium. So what vitamin D does is to increase the permeability of the intestine, so that when you eat foods rich in calcium or you drink that vitamin D fortified milk, that vitamin D, whether it's made by the skin or it's getting in with dietary, such as your milk, it causes the intestine to be more permeable to calcium. More permeable means that calcium is going to be resorbed back into the body and then into the bloodstream so it can be used. So by making the intestine more permeable, that means that we retain it in the body rather than it ending up in the toilet. All right, there are other chemicals that are going to be made by the skin as well, and some of those are enzymes that are going to inactivate some carcinogens. Carcinogen is a cancer-causing agent. But then there are other chemicals, other enzymes that are going to cause those carcinogens to become more active. There are enzymes that change cortisol into hydrocortisone. Cortisol is what you typically have in ointments that you put on, like bug bites, or put it on for swelling. That cortisol then is changed in the skin by enzymes that are made by the skin into hydrocortisone, and hydrocortisone is an anti-inflammatory agent, so it helps to relieve that inflammation. All right, what next? Fluid and electrolyte balance. As we've talked about already with the keratin, of course, the keratin in the skin is a tough, waxy protein, and what it does is to prevent excess water loss, so you don't lose too much water from the body, but also prevents too much water from getting in. If you go swimming or you take a shower or you take a bath, all that water is prevented from entering your skin because of that tough keratin layer. Now, some water does get in, some water does get out, but the keratin prevents excessive exchange of the water. Of course, you do store water and electrolytes in your skin. Once again, the skin being a barrier prevents excess loss of either one, but allows escape when it needs to be gotten rid of, as your water and your electrolytes are excreted in your sweat. And absorption, the final function we want to talk about on this slide. The skin is important for absorption of certain things. Now, we mentioned it being a barrier, but some things do get across the skin. Let's think about some things that actually get across the skin and into your body. Some of those are vitamins, such as A, D, E, and K. Estrogen and nicotine. Patches. Now, I'm talking about estrogen patches and nicotine patches. The motion sickness patches that you put behind your ear if you're going on a cruise or if you get motion sickness from flying or anything like that. What would you think all of these would have to have in common in order for them to get into the skin, get into the cells across the skin? I hope you remember what the cell membrane is made of. Remember, it's a phospholipid bilayer. So all of these components that we just mentioned here have to be lipid soluble. So they are also lipid-based molecules. What happens when lipid meets lipid? They merge together, right? Like putting 2 drops of oil in a pan of water, you're eventually going to have 1 big drop of oil. If you pour it in there when you're cooking spaghetti, all those oil droplets eventually merge into 1 big glob. That's because when in an aqueous or watery environment, the lipids are going to merge together. And your body, of course, is an aqueous environment. So when lipid meets lipid, those membranes merge with those lipid components, and those components actually get into the cell. All right, one other function we want to talk about now is the sensation of the sensory receptors that are located within the skin. So when we're talking about cutaneous sensations, we're talking about sensory receptors that are located within the skin that then send those signals as they are brought in to the nervous system for interpretation. Of course, heat and cold, you know when you touch something with your skin, whether it's hot or cold, the reason you know that is because you have thermoreceptors. So you have the 2 different kinds, of course, one that is sensitive to increased heat, one that is sensitive to a decrease in temperature. So your thermoreceptors detect that, send that stimulus to the brain, and your brain interprets that. You have receptors that are called touch and pressure receptors. Your Pacinian or Pacinian, both pronunciations are okay, are pressure receptors. These are typically located deep within the dermis. Now, let's look over here and see if there's anything on here. Nerve cell process. These right here are supposed to be your Pacinian corpuscles. They're typically located deeper within the dermal layer, so usually more like down in here. These are the receptors that are going to be responsive to pressure, whether it's a light pressure or a harder pressure. They're located deeper within the dermis, so it takes a little bit more to stimulate these. Your Meissner's corpuscles are responsible for touch and texture. So these are stimulated by a very, very light brushing touch, but also these allow you to feel the difference in a smooth surface and a rough surface. Like if you rub your hand across a piece of paper versus a piece of sandpaper, you detect the difference in that texture because of your Meissner's corpuscles. These are typically located up in the papillary layer of the dermis. So they're going to be located up in the dermal papillae. You may or may not be able to see these in lab. Hopefully you'll be able to point some of these out as you do look at the slides. But you're not going to see a perfect little structure. What you will see is just an accumulation of lots of cell nuclei up in there, and that's typically what you will see for a Meissner's corpuscle. But remember, these are stimulated by a very light touch. And the other thing, of course, pain receptors. These are called nociceptors or nocireceptors or nociceptors. And these, of course, pick up a painful stimulus. They're responsive to pain, send that stimulus to the brain for interpretation. Okay, let's move on now, see what else we want to talk about. Let's talk a little bit more about keratinized versus non-keratinized skin because they do have different functions. Now remember, you've got a list of questions here. I want you to try to answer these. Okay, so remember keratin. What's the function of keratin? What does keratin do? It's a tough, waterproof, waxy protein, so it keeps you from dehydrating or from overhydrating. So it regulates the amount of fluid that is lost or gained into and out of the body. So how would you expect these types of skin to appear different when you have skin that is keratinized versus non-keratinized? Where are you going to find keratinized skin? The areas of the body that are dry, such as the external coverings of the body, right? But you also have skin located within your mouth, your anal canal, your vagina if you're a woman, your urethra, whether you're a male or a female. And what is the characteristic of this skin that's different from what you see out here? Dry versus wet, right? Okay, so where you see keratinized skin, you're going to find dry skin. Non-keratinized skin is the wet skin, the skin that stays moist. So that just answered the next two questions. Now the last question I'm going to leave. I'm not going to answer that for you because I want you to think about what might happen if you could not produce keratin. When would this be a problem and what would the problem be? I'll leave you thinking on that one. I'm not going to answer it. All right. Within the skin, of course, we do have several types of glands. Hopefully you've seen these in lab. But we'll talk first about your sebaceous glands. Your sebaceous glands secrete oil. So around your hair follicles, you're going to have a sebaceous gland located usually on either side of that hair follicle or on both sides of that hair follicle that's going to secrete sebum, which is an oily product, into the hair shaft or into the hair follicle and out onto the hair shaft. This has an antifungal property, so it helps to keep fungus from growing on your skin, on your scalp. The ceruminous glands are a specialized gland that secrete a waxy component known as cerumen. Anybody know where those are located? Where do you have wax? In the ears, right? Okay, so this is a protective wax that prevents not only moisture loss or gain, but also it's very sticky, so it traps things that may get into the ear canal before it gets into the body. Then, of course, your sweat glands. We have two different types of sweat glands. Okay, you have the eccrine sweat gland and the apocrine sweat gland. These are different in their function and different in what they secrete as well. Your eccrine sweat glands secrete a watery sweat up through a duct and opens as a pore on the surface of the skin. So these are used primarily in thermoregulation, getting rid of excess body heat as you sweat. As I mentioned, this is a very watery sweat, and these are typically the sweat glands that are activated first. So when you walk outside and you start getting warm, where do you start sweating first? It's usually not the underarms first. You'll start getting little beads of sweat over your top lip and your forehead, the back of your neck, maybe a little on the chest, down the back, the bends of the knees. Yeah, that's where you find these eccrine sweat glands. So they're usually the first that are activated. And then we have the apocrine sweat glands, which secrete through a duct into that hair follicle. Now these are a little bit different. They secrete a very mucousy, oily, viscous or thick sweat. Okay, this is the sweat that also contains chemicals known as pheromones. Okay, do you know what pheromones are? Pheromones are chemicals that are sexual attractants. Now, before we go any further with that, let's talk about where these sweat glands are located. Your apocrine sweat glands are located in the axillary, the underarm region, and also the pubic and genital region. So they're associated with the hairs of these particular regions. Now, what do you know about those two regions and sweating? Yep, creates an odor, right? Okay, so these pheromones are chemical attractants that typically begin to appear around puberty. So think about when you're around young children, say kindergartners or 8-year-olds out on the playground and they're sweating or they've been playing ball and they come back around to you and they're soaking wet with sweat and their hair's drenched. But do they smell like you do when you sweat? Nah, they smell sort of a sour sweat, and that's because of the bacteria on their bodies as well, creating byproducts that create that sour lactic acid smell, sort of acidy smell. But when an adult or someone that has just entered puberty begins to sweat, you start smelling that musty odor in their sweat. That's, of course, because these pheromones begin to be secreted or begin to be made in the body when you reach puberty. All right, let's see. What else did I want to tell you about that? I think that's all on that slide. So let's move on to the next one. And we'll talk about things that affect the color of your hair and your skin. Of course, there are several different things that can affect this. The first is genetic factors. What genes did you get? You're going to, of course, inherit your genes from your parents. So chances are you may look like them, but you may not, depending on what copy of the gene you got, right? So what does vary is according to what genes you received. All right, now, when we're talking about skin color and we're talking about hair color, remember this is primarily because of the melanin. Melanin is a protein that's coded for by a particular gene. And it's the amount and the size of those melanin granules that varies. Typically, there's not a lot of difference in the number of melanocytes. Remember, the melanocytes create the melanin. There's not a lot of difference in the number of melanocytes in very light-skinned people versus very dark-skinned people. What does differ is the way they make that melanin, whether they make very, very large melanin pigments or particles, or whether they make very small ones. And also the color can vary as well, whether they make a very light-colored melanin that is sort of yellowish in tint, or a very dark brown. Now remember, the function of melanin is to protect the nucleus of the cells that are underneath that melanin. So you would expect people that have their heredity, their ethnicity based in areas that have more sunlight. Of course, closer to the equator, you typically find people with much darker skin because they create more melanin granules and larger granules. Not that they have more melanocytes. What about an albino? You know what an albino is? This is a person that has a very, very, very pale skin color, very pale eyes, typically white hair. They have a genetic defect so that their body doesn't know how to create melanin. So they have that very, very pale appearance. What's the danger of that? Yeah, their cells get exposed to a lot of UV radiation, so they have to wear hats and sunscreens and sunglasses when they're outside. All right, there are also physiological factors that can affect the skin color. These are usually temporary, such as vasodilation or vasoconstriction. Vasodilation, this happens when you get very hot or you get embarrassed. What happens to your face? What happens to your skin? You become red, right? That happens because the blood vessels in the skin are going to dilate, and as they do so, they carry more blood out to the surface. That blood, because of the oxygen that it carries, has a red coloration to it. So you get that red appearance. Vasoconstriction, of course, when the blood vessels constrict, they carry less blood. Therefore, you appear more pale. Let's see. What else did I want to tell you on this? Some of the physiological effects also. Abnormal coloration, such as cyanosis. You know what cyanosis is? I can't write. Cyanosis is when you have a bluish color to your skin, to your lips, to your fingernails, and this is because of a lack of oxygen being carried in the blood. Someone that is in danger of drowning, of course they're not getting enough oxygen in. If you are very, very cold, you have that pooling away of the blood from the skin to the core to keep the organs warm. So all this results in a bluish coloration because there's less blood carrying oxygen out to the surface. Jaundice. Jaundice is a result of a buildup of a yellowish pigment known as bilirubin. and or biliverdin. Okay, both of these are components that are made when red blood cells are broken down. Okay, and it has to do, you're going to learn more about this in 202, but just to keep it pretty simple right now, the yellow color is usually noticed first in the eyes and then in the skin, and it's because of either liver malfunction or in the case of newborn babies that are may be born premature sometimes, but not always, just prematures, the liver is immature. Okay, so you don't have complete breakdown of these bilirubin and biliverdin products, and they tend to build up, and by doing so, they impart that yellow coloration to the skin and the eyes. And the last thing I want to talk about on this are environmental factors, and the primary one to understand here is the sun. Okay, the sun has UV radiation that shines down on your body. Now, we're talking sun or tanning beds. Yes, I know. It happens, though. Don't argue. I know I'm right. Anyway, regardless what the exposure, whether it's sun or tanning beds, that UV radiation stimulates your melanocytes to create more melanin. Okay, they're stimulated to do that because of the damage to the DNA in those cells. Okay, remember UV radiation mutates DNA. When it does so, the melanocytes are stimulated to make more melanin so that they can try to do a better job to protect those cells. And by producing more melanin, you're producing more of those pigments, and you end up with a darker color known as a tan. So really a tan is your body's response to damaged DNA. Pleasant thought, huh? Guess you know now why I'm so pale. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about on this clip is acne and aging skin, so disorders of the skin. Acne is the most common skin disorder, and it is due to overactive sebaceous glands that typically become overactive during puberty. These sebaceous glands are producing more and more sebum, which is an oil. It clogs the pores of the skin, and bacteria accumulate within those pores. Your immune system sends out phagocytes and macrophages to try to eat away all of that bacteria, and by doing so, that creates a lot of waste products and cellular debris in that area. So all of that creates a substance known as pus, which causes the skin to become inflamed around that particular pore. All right, so that's what creates whiteheads. Blackheads are typically just caused by an accumulation of the sebum and the bacteria without the inflammation. So this is all because of an inflammatory response when you end up with these big whiteheads known as comedones. C-O-M-E-D-O-N-E-S. That's the big name for a whitehead. All right, so what's the most common way to deal with these? What do most people do? They want to squeeze them. They want to pop them. Well, I want to tell you why you're recommended not to do that. When you're squeezing and popping, what are you doing? You're pushing on that skin. Now, you've got this accumulation of bacteria in there that has already caused the pus and the inflammation, leading to an infection, or what could lead to an infection. When you squeeze on that pimple, you're just as likely to push some of that bacteria in deeper as you are to push it out. And, of course, that can get into the body deeper and lead to a systemic infection. So what should you do? Well, if it is a problem and you have severe acne, of course, you want to see a dermatologist, which may prescribe you antibiotics to kill the bacteria. They may prescribe you some type of drying cream or ointment to put on to try to dry up some of the inflammation, to reduce the inflammation, to get rid of some of what's going on there. And guys, sorry, but for girls, you can also take birth control pills to reduce acne. And the reason for that is because the hormones of puberty, the estrogen and the androgens, especially the androgens, which are the male hormones, cause these overactive sebaceous glands. So if you can take birth control pills, it actually helps your body to regulate that estrogen a little bit more. You'll get more of that in 202 as well. And by doing so, it does have a calming effect on those sebaceous glands. But another thing I want to point out here, acne is not caused by chocolate, it's not caused by drinking Cokes, and it's not caused by eating greasy foods. So why does everybody tell you that? It's a correlation, which means two things happen at the same time. Puberty happens when you become a teenager, right, or somewhere around that area. What also happens at that time? You get a little bit more control over what you eat because mama's not feeding you every meal, right? You're going to eat greasy hamburgers and french fries with a Coke. You're going to run down to the store and grab a Hershey bar. So you're eating more of those types of food. At the same time, you're having all this hormonal stuff going on. So it's not a cause and effect. It's simply a correlation. They occur at the same time. All right, last thing I want to talk about is aging skin. So I put up this picture of Sophia Loren. If you begin here with picture number 1, very young, healthy, firm skin. And as you follow the progression, you start to see a few things happen. Here you're starting to see a few little wrinkles. Over here, looks like we may have had a little work done. And as she continues to age, look at the sagging skin around the neck. And then as you get to this more recent picture over here, you have more wrinkles along the jawline. These wrinkles from the nose to the mouth have become more pronounced. You can still see some of the wrinkling here around the neck. So what's causing all this to happen? Well, there's a couple of different things. First of all, your wrinkles are caused by a breakdown of the collagen fibers. Okay, remember your skin has all these fibers, elastic and collagen fibers within them. And collagen fibers, after being creased and moved around, because your face moves a lot, and this is occurring year after year after year after year of all of this moving, those collagen fibers being bent and bent and bent, finally they stop going back to their normal shape, and they allow wrinkling to occur. Sagging is typically a loss of skin tone or skin firmness, and this is a breakdown of those elastin fibers. Remember, elastic stretches and springs back. So think about what happens if you've got old underwear. You've worn it and you've worn it and you've worn it and you've worn it, and what happens? That elastic waistband wears out. Same thing happens with the elastin molecules within the skin. And the other thing that happens with the aging of skin, where you typically see a lot of the sagging and the sallow appearance or sort of sunken in, that's due to a loss in the subcutaneous fat layer that is a part of the hypodermis. This also contributes to the inability of older folks being able to regulate their body temperature as well. So you may notice when you go into Granny's house. My little grandmother's 99 years old, and in the wintertime, it is so incredibly hot in her house. You walk in there and you automatically start sweating, and you want to start taking off clothes. So the reason for that is me being younger, and I'm not young by any stretch of the imagination, but younger than Granny by many years. I still have a lot more adipose tissue, where she has lost more of that adipose tissue that provides insulation. So it's more difficult for her to maintain her body temperature. So she does so by using external factors, such as that thermostat and cranking it up to 80. Okay, sorry this one ran a bit longer than the others, but I did want to try to get everything in on one video. I'll try to keep the next one shorter. No promises, but I'm going to try my best. Y'all have a great day.